The defense budget should be cut more than in half rather than being increased right now, but starting with the most dangerous weapons, the ICBMs.
The best known of the working class underground groupings was the Baum Group, who, whether for good or ill, is associated with one act of sabotage.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Daniel Ellsberg won the Gandhi Peace Award in 1976, mainly for exposing the Pentagon Papers, which detailed U.S. lies about its Vietnam War. Ellsberg was also part of Crimes Against Humanity. That's not my claim, that's what he says. Before he was anti-war, Ellsberg was a nuclear war planner, and he was involved in making a war plan that would have ended the lives of 400 million people.
Let me say, in connection with my past talk here, Amy, I said I would plead not guilty if I were charged with possessing these classified documents from Chelsea Manning for the last 12 years. If I were charged with having participated in my nuclear war planning phase for years, in the construction of the doomsday machine here, and the provocation of a doomsday machine later in the Soviet Union, I would not plead not guilty. I would plead guilty to having participated in a crime against humanity. And the same is true if I were to be tried, fat chance, but if I were to be tried, along with my colleagues, I presume, of a crime against humanity and aggressive war in Vietnam. Again, I could not plead not guilty to that. That's the difference. One of those, these last ones, threaten all life on Earth. The secrecy system, which I am trying to propose here, is part of that system that threatens not only our democracy, but by protecting these outrageous, criminal, immoral plans, is part of a crime that is not at all without victims. It would make victims of nearly every human on Earth.
Now, he said things like this before when talking about his latest book, Doomsday Machine. Amy Goodman asked him about the here and now. How do we change course, she said.
The defense budget should be cut more than in half rather than being increased right now, but starting with the most dangerous weapons, the ICBMs, enacting that a no first use case, which we should be using against Putin right now, and saying that his first use threats, like ours in the past, are outrageous and illegal.
I think there's a lot to that strategy. ICBMs are intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they are used to deliver nuclear bombs. Reduce their numbers and you really reduce the threat of all-out nuclear war. No first use, which Ellsberg mentions, is the declaration by a country that it would not be the first to explode a nuclear bomb. Now, that's not just words. If a country had that doctrine in effect, that would give cover to any military officers who think it necessary to refuse in order to start a nuclear attack. Like the Soviet officer in 1982, Stanislav Petrov, who refused to follow Soviet rules on what turned out to be a false radar report of a U.S. nuclear attack. While we're on the subject of nuclear, I want to remind you about the petition to ban imports of Russian uranium. Our report on the subject has been delayed. See the link to the petition at peace.org. As this year draws to a close, I want to mention a page on our website that has 25 of our best photos on Palestine, Ukraine, Syria, and more. We link to it from thestruggle.org. Now, some of the talk by author Merilyn Moos about anti-Nazi Germans. It was the subject of a book she wrote about the many heroic Germans in 1930s. She spoke as part of a program by promoting enduring peace at Southern Connecticut State University.
I'm going to start with an explanation for the rise and success of the Nazis in Germany. And I'm afraid I'm largely going to be reading this. Then I will discuss how, despite the fact this has been ignored by many historians, a significant minority of the German working class resisted the Nazis. And then I will move on to considering similarities and differences with today, which, as we know, and has already been referred to, is unfortunately becoming quite topical. I'm going to be focusing on the US and the UK. It's usually forgotten or ignored that the Nazis' first aim was to crush the organized working class. So Nazism's roots lay in the defeat by the ultra-right of the working class revolutions in Germany of 1918-19. So in Munich, already mentioned, a first attempted revolution in November 1918 at the very end of the war failed. But then a few months later, in April 1919, the administration of Munich was taken over by factory councils. Armed workers patrolled the streets during a general strike. A Soviet was declared, but all was very far from well. Ebert, who had become the Social Democratic president, after this I'll be referring to the SPD, after the Kaiser had abdicated, was terrified of revolution. And he sent in 30,000 Freikorps to Munich on May the 1st, at all dates. The Freikorps were a quasi-fascistic, unofficial army of paramilitaries made up largely of ex-soldiers. And they repressed the uprising brutally, executed an estimated 300 men and women, including the Soviet leader Eugene Levine. The revolution was put down in blood. Many of the the reason why this is relevant is many of the Nazi party's future leaders were members of the Freikorps in Munich. Ernst Röhm, future head of the SA, Himmler, future head of the SS, Heydrich, second to Hitler, Hess, future commander of Auschwitz, and Frank, the Nazi governor general of Poland. And the SA, the stormtroopers or brown shirts, who were founded in 1921 by Hitler, also drew most of its initial membership from the Freikorps. Their first task was to provide the Nazi party basically with protection, but they quickly became a mass organization. And it is generally overlooked that during the later Weimar years, something like civil war took place in some of the streets of Berlin and other cities when the SA street fighting gangs ran a campaign of terror against the labor movement and the left. As I know from interviews I carried out many years ago of people who had been anti-Nazi activists, up till 1933, the SA regularly attacked anti-Nazis on the streets, in the housing estates, broke down people's doors, and maneuvered and fought to gain control of meeting places such as taverns, crucial, many fights over taverns, and community centers, and sometimes murdered militants with the police often turning a blind eye. I don't have time for this, but my father, who was a member of the German Communist Party, the KPD, led a Red Front group and used to go off into the woods for target practice, which apparently he was lousy at. But anyway, by 1933, the SA had a membership of around 2 million and support of about double that. And I would argue that the mass movement of the SA was a precondition for the Nazi success. I mean, I think it's quite crucial to understand that. Anyway, on January the 30th, 1933, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, the fight against the labor movement became officially sanctioned state policy. And then the Reichstag fire of February 33 provided an excuse and the Nazis arrested 60 to 70,000 members of the KPD, almost half of its membership, and other left-wingers, of whom some thousands were murdered. And in 1933 alone, about 200,000 political prisoners were detained. And the first camps were not for Jews, but for political prisoners. One reason the Nazis were able to gain power, despite the strength of the German labor movement and the combined vote for the left, was that both the Social Democrats, the SPD, and the KPD, the communists, fatally misunderstood the role of the Nazis and failed to form any sort of united front. The SPD leadership was wedded to the parliamentary road. Their identification with the Weimar Republic led them to conclude there was no difference between the Nazis and communists, as both groups opposed, they argued, the Republic. The leadership were against a united front and didn't in general support anti-Nazi activities. The communist leadership pursued a catastrophic ultra-left policy, refusing to cooperate with the SPD against the Nazis, whom they denounced as social fascists. From about 1928 until about 35-ish, the KPD saw the SPD as their main enemies who acted to embed bourgeois rule. They did not recognize the Nazis' intention was to smash the organized working class, and also didn't call for or support a united front. Making matters even worse, in 1933, they thought the Nazis were a temporary blip. And the famous quote is, "After them, us." Ha ha. There were a small number of extraordinarily brave grouplets, such as the Young Socialist Workers, the International Socialist Combat League, the Socialist Workers' Party, who called for a united front and had fallen out with their parent body, the SPD. And there was a breakaway from the KPD opposition, which also demanded a united front. The talk of an anti-Nazi united front from the tiny Trotskyists and other non-communist, non-social democratic left groups all ran into an ideological brick wall, except in a few exceptional areas, such as in Wuppertal, where in fact the Nazis were very strong. But there, an anarcho-syndicalist group called the Free Workers' Union of Germany argued for and tried to construct united action. I mean, they were all arrested and destroyed very quickly. I want to move on to discuss the resistance to the Nazis after they did gain power. I'm only referring here to deliberate resistance, and for further discussion of this, do read our book, which I believe is on sale, kindly organized. And I'm focusing on the resistance of members of the working class rather than on the more publicized resistance, or for example, the brave middle-class White Rose student grouping, or the July 1944 plotters who were led by von Stauffenberg, who was an ardent right-winger. The July plot was led, in fact, by many of the leaders were military, and they were organizing late in the day, primarily because they saw Hitler as leading Germany to defeat, rather than because they had always been anti-Nazis. Broadly, the resistance falls into two phases. It's from 1933 until roughly 35, and then during the war. It's a simplification, but it'll do. That the resistance falls into generally two phases, and the first phase is from 33 till about 35. And one early group who are virtually unheard of are the Gebauer group. I'm very fond of them, who smuggled at great risk thousands of wanted comrades out of Germany, across the mountains into Czechoslovakia, and brought illegal literature in. I mean, it's interesting because it's a group who were peopled by members of the gymnastics and sports movement, the proletarian mountaineering organization, who were crucial because they knew how to get across the mountains in the Red Front. So, I mean, it's an illustration of how the socialist left in Germany was rooted in cultural activities. Anyway, the second phase of the resistance essentially began after the end of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, a non-aggression pact between the USSR and Germany, which lasted from August 39 to mid-1940. And the focus of the members of the KPD, and of course we're now in war, then became building cells in factories, especially in the arms industry, which is often deadly. One group led by Robert Ulrich, who was a KPD member in Berlin, set up about 20 factory groups. Their priority was to leaflet and organize sabotage and go-slows in factories, contributing to Germany's war effort. I mean, these people were almost all murdered very, very quickly. The network was in touch with about 80 workers in the Berlin Weapons and Armaments Works, Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabrik Berkewerke near Berlin, which employed about 50,000 forced civilian laborers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. A later group led by Anton Zeflov, along with Franz Jakob and Bernhard Bestlein, all members of the Communist Party, probably the largest of the resistance groups, who had about 500 people around them, also focused on armaments factories and similarly called for sabotage and the end of war, which is quite remarkable because they were calling for their own country, basically, to cease fighting. At the Escania works, which specialized in making precision instruments for the armaments industry, and which, quote, employed about 5,000 to 7,000 forced laborers, including later on women from Ravensbrück concentration camp, they built a cell of around 50 people. It's quite interesting. As the war progresses, these groups become more and more open to anybody who wants to join them. While I have no time to develop on my next point, it's worth remembering how far the German war economy depended on the millions of forced and nominally free laborers, prisoners of war, concentration camp prisoners, who constituted 25 to 40% of all workers in Germany and, quote, Greater Germany by around 1944. Even in the crucial armaments industry, which the Nazis didn't wanted staffed by Aryans, between a third and 50% of the workers were foreigners. One example, at Daimler-Benz, a key arms manufacturer with close ties to the Nazi regime, 53% of the workers were Russians as early as July 1942, rising to 67% in 1944. I mean, that opens many questions, which perhaps we can talk about later. The best known of the working class underground groupings was the Baum Group, who, whether for good or ill, is associated with one act of sabotage in Germany when they tried and failed to blow up the Nazi anti-Soviet propaganda exhibition, the Soviet Paradise, in 1942, leading to terrible revenge killings by the SS. However, the Baum Group also organized sabotage at Siemens, another armaments factory, where Baum and others from his group had become part of the contingent of about 30,000 Jewish forced laborers. I must emphasize how important young people were in resisting the Nazis, something we forget at our peril. The Edelweiss Pirates, I'm fond of them, a loose, non-hierarchical network of largely working-class young people. Many actually were women, have received little positive attention. They drew many of their supporters from the array of youth nature groups, which were a long-term feature of German society. In Cologne, according to Gestapo records, not always reliable, they had at least 3,000 supporters. They wore unconventional clothes, sang anti-militaristic songs, assaulted Hitler youth patrols, at least once with brass knuckles, insulted uniformed officers, robbed Hitler youth, obtained illicit firearms, and produced anti-Nazi propaganda. In one example, they threw bricks through the windows of a munitions factory. In another, poured sugar water into the petrol tanks of Nazi cars. Partly because it was loosely organized, they initially evaded arrest, though they suffered appalling losses in the last years of the war. There were other sources of resistance I don't have time to go into. For example, there was limited resistance in the German army, the Wehrmacht. Hundreds of members who either deliberately crossed, only hundreds, deliberately crossed over to the Red Army or loitered on the battlefields in the USSR long enough to be picked up. I also have to mention in passing the amazing 999s, an army unit that political undesirables were herded into and who deserted en masse, especially when sent to Greece. And also hundreds of German refugees volunteered to fight in the earlier Spanish Civil War or later with the British Army. A question which again maybe we can explore in discussion is, why is this history so little known? It is unusual to find much German research on the resistance till the late 1980s, and I want to suggest a few reasons. First of all, the Cold War, which started a few years after 1945, turned communists and fellow travelers into enemies. Regrettably, many historians went along with the Cold War ideology and paid little systematic attention to working class resistance. Secondly, in Germany itself, members of the resistance were regularly viewed as traitors. Even future Chancellor Willy Brandt was called a traitor in the mid-1950s. In the first decades after the war, while members of the Nazi Party received reparations, some members of the resistance found getting reparations very difficult. As late as the 1980s, the son of von Stauffenberg, the same von Stauffenberg who'd led the coup, attempted coup, announced he would not cooperate with the newly established Resistance Museum in Berlin if they included material about communists. That's as late as the 1980s. Finally, and I'm aware this is controversial, the Eichmann trial in 1961 marked the beginnings of a profound shift in the approach to Nazism, which was subsequently increasingly understood as primarily targeting and murdering Jews. I now want to move on to the third part of this talk, which is to consider how we potentially could be facing our own 1933 moment. One crucial difference, and I think a lot of this, some of you in America will know better than me. One crucial difference between what happened in Germany and what is presently happening, at least in Britain, is that the success of the Nazi regime was rooted in the success of the SA street fighters. I would argue, as I said before, it's a critical component of the Nazi success. Here in Britain, grassroots ultra-right street fighting groups have so far not succeeded in mobilizing in significant numbers. And as a few people in the audience I've noticed will remember, in the 1970s, Rock Against Racism helped sway young popular opinion against the racists who were gaining increasing support. But that was 50 odd years ago. And that generation are now at least middle-aged. Another explanation for the absence of fascistic street gangs is that today the British Tory party has absorbed and to an extent defanged the ultra-right. Farage and UKIP did not orientate onto the streets, but encouraged their supporters to become members of the Tory party, and indeed have recently successfully become if not the dominant faction in the Tory party. In America, remember, this is me basing myself on the press, there's been a growing presence on the streets of ultra-right gangs. According to the US Capitol Police, cases relating to statements and threats just against members of Congress jumped from almost 4,000 in 2017 to close to 10,000 in 2021, more than double, and I gather have increased even further in the last year. As I write this on the 29th of October, and a lot of you will recognize our date, an attacker broke down the door of the Pelosi household and attacked Pelosi's husband in lieu of Pelosi herself. Then there was the attempted insurrection on the Capitol in January 2021. And I mean, these attacks have gone beyond just attacks on Congress and the legislature. During a protest against a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville in 1917, Heather Heyer, civil rights activist, was killed. And as the Nazis did before 1933, Trump, I don't know how significant you all think he is, but Trump appears to walk a wafer-thin line between encouraging insurrection and seeking political legitimacy.
I wrote an article for our website called New Facts About the Awful Rabbi Kahane, that late fascist rabbi who was the inspiration, or is the inspiration, for Itamar Ben-Gvir, who will soon take over as the commander of Israeli police. It includes revelations that Kahane's political life started not with Jewish affairs at all, but with work or attacks against anti-Vietnam War protesters and against African Americans. My article and the article it's based on from Haaretz can be accessed via our archive on articles about Palestine and Israel. We'll close with a few photos about a demonstration for Ukraine in Chicago. By the way, I saw on Democracy Now! That 1,000 members of the clergy are calling for a Christmas ceasefire in Ukraine. Wonder why they've never called for Russia to stop bombing the entire Ukrainian civilian electrical grid. More on that next week. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.